In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pressed deeper into Nazi-occupied Europe, a German Wehrmacht colonel named Friedrich Kellner made a decision that would puzzle historians for 8 decades. He walked out of his command post near the French border, left his uniform folded neatly on his desk, and vanished into thin air. No body was ever found. No witness came forward. No records explained his disappearance. For 80 years, the mystery of Colonel Kellner remained one of World War II's most baffling cold cases. That is, until a team of urban explorers stumbled upon something extraordinary hidden beneath the streets of Berlin. What they discovered would not only solve the riddle of the missing colonel, but reveal a secret so shocking that it would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the final days of the Third Reich. August 15, 1944. The war was turning against Germany. Allied bombers filled the skies over the fatherland. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly from the east. And in a small command bunker outside Metz, France, Colonel Friedrich Kellner sat alone at his desk, staring at a coded telegram that had arrived just hours earlier. The message was brief, marked with the highest security classification. Only 3 words mattered: Operation Valkyrie compromised. Kellner's hands trembled as he read those words again. He knew what they meant. The plot to assassinate Hitler had failed. The conspirators were being rounded up, names were being extracted under torture, and his name was almost certainly on that list. Friedrich Kellner wasn't supposed to be a hero. Born in 1895 to a middle-class family in Munich, he had served as a young officer in the Great War, earning commendations for bravery under fire. After the war, he'd returned to civilian life, working as an engineer and raising a family. When Hitler rose to power, Kellner had initially supported the Nazi regime like millions of other Germans. He believed in the promise of national renewal. He wore the uniform with pride. But by 1943, everything had changed. The turning point came during a visit to the Eastern Front. Kellner had been sent to inspect defensive positions near Stalingrad. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mass graves filled with civilians. Entire villages burned to the ground. Systematic atrocities carried out in the name of the Reich. In his private diary, discovered decades later, Kellner wrote these chilling words: "I came here as a German officer. I leave as a man who has seen the face of evil. God forgive us for what we have done." Upon returning to France, Kellner began making contact with other disillusioned officers. Secret meetings were held in abandoned farmhouses. Coded messages passed between trusted allies. They called themselves the Iron Cross Resistance, a network of Wehrmacht officers who had turned against their own regime. Their plan was audacious. They would coordinate with the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. Once the Führer was dead, they would surrender their units to Allied forces, opening a gap in German defenses that could end the war months earlier. But someone had betrayed them. The Gestapo had infiltrated their network. And now, as Kellner sat in his bunker reading that fateful telegram, he knew his time was running out. Within hours, SS troops would arrive to arrest him. He would be tortured until he revealed the names of his co-conspirators. Then he would be executed as a traitor, unless he disappeared first. What happened next defied explanation. According to his aide, Lieutenant Hans Kruger, Kellner dismissed all personnel from the bunker at 6 p.m. that evening. He claimed he needed to review sensitive documents in private. Kruger was the last person to see him alive. When the lieutenant returned the following morning, he found Kellner's office empty. The colonel's uniform was folded neatly on his chair. His personal effects remained untouched. His service pistol lay on the desk, unfired. But Friedrich Kellner had vanished without a trace. The initial investigation was swift but fruitless. SS teams scoured the surrounding countryside. Dogs tracked his scent to the edge of a nearby forest, then lost it completely. Local French resistance fighters were interrogated, but none had seen the missing colonel. German deserters were questioned at Allied prisoner camps. Again, nothing. It was as if Kellner had simply evaporated into the morning mist. As the war ground toward its bloody conclusion, the mystery of the missing colonel became just another unsolved puzzle in a conflict filled with them. The Iron Cross resistance was systematically dismantled. Its members were executed or sent to concentration camps. The secret of what they had planned died with them, and Friedrich Kellner became just another name on a very long list of the disappeared. The decades that followed brought countless theories but no answers. Some believed Kellner had been captured by the French resistance and executed as a war criminal. Others suggested he had fled to South America like so many other Nazi officials. A few historians proposed that he had been killed by his own men to prevent him from revealing classified information. But none of these theories could explain the complete absence of evidence. No body, no witnesses, no documentation of his escape or capture. It was as if Colonel Friedrich Kellner had been erased from history itself. The closest anyone came to solving the mystery was in 1987, when a construction crew working on renovations to the Louvre discovered a skeleton buried beneath the museum's foundations. The remains were those of a tall man, approximately 50 years old, wearing the remnants of a German military uniform. For a brief moment, historians believed they had found their missing colonel. But dental records proved otherwise. The skeleton belonged to an unknown Wehrmacht sergeant who had died during the liberation of Paris. Kellner remained lost to time. Fast forward to March 15, 2024. Berlin's underground scene had always attracted adventurous souls looking to explore the city's hidden history. Urban explorers regularly ventured into abandoned tunnels, forgotten bunkers, and sealed chambers that dotted the German capital like scars from its troubled past. Most of these expeditions yielded nothing more than graffiti, empty bottles, and the occasional piece of wartime debris. But on this particular morning, 3 young explorers were about to make a discovery that would change everything. Marcus Weber, Sarah Hoffman, and Dmitry Volkov had been exploring Berlin's underground for over 5 years. They called themselves the Mole People, documenting their adventures on social media and sharing maps of the city's hidden spaces. They weren't treasure hunters or thrill seekers. They were historians at heart, passionate about preserving the memory of Berlin's layered past. Each tunnel told a story. Every abandoned room held secrets, and they had made it their mission to uncover those secrets before they were lost forever. On that March morning, they had entered the tunnel system through a maintenance access point near Alexanderplatz. Their destination was a section of the underground that had been sealed since the 1962 when East German authorities had blocked off dozens of passages to prevent escape attempts to the west. Recent construction work had accidentally breached one of these seals, creating a narrow opening that only the most dedicated explorers would attempt to navigate. The passage was cramped, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees for nearly 200 meters. Their headlamps cut through the darkness, illuminating walls of crumbling concrete and rusted steel reinforcements. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of decades of abandonment. Water dripped steadily from overhead pipes, creating small pools that reflected their lights like mirrors. It was the kind of place that most people would find claustrophobic and terrifying. For the Mole People, it was exactly where they belonged. After 40 minutes of crawling, the passage opened into a larger chamber. The explorers stood and stretched, grateful to be upright again. Their lights revealed a circular room approximately 4 meters in diameter with walls of reinforced concrete. But this wasn't just another abandoned storage space or utility room. Someone had lived here, and recently. Against one wall stood a simple wooden desk, its surface covered with papers and photographs. A narrow bed occupied another corner, its military-style blankets folded with precise hospital corners. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, documents, and personal effects that seemed frozen in time. And hanging on a peg near the entrance was something that made all three explorers gasp in unison. A German Wehrmacht colonel's uniform, complete with medals and insignia from World War II. Sarah was the first to approach the desk. Her hands shook as she picked up a leather-bound journal that lay open to its final entry. The handwriting was neat, methodical, written in faded blue ink. The date at the top of the page made her heart race. March 10th, 2024. Just 5 days earlier, someone had been living in this underground chamber until very recently. And according to the identity papers scattered across the desk, that someone was Colonel Friedrich Kellner, the Wehrmacht officer who had vanished without a trace in 1944. The room was a time capsule, but not from the 1,940 seconds. It was a carefully maintained living space that spanned 8 decades of hidden existence. Maps on the walls showed the evolution of Berlin from its wartime destruction through its division and eventual reunification. Newspaper clippings documented major world events from the perspective of someone who had watched history unfold from the shadows. And photographs, hundreds of them, showed the same face aging slowly over the course of 80 years. Friedrich Kellner had not died in 1944. He had been living beneath the streets of Berlin, hiding in plain sight, waiting for something that would finally allow him to emerge from the darkness. But what had he been waiting for? And why, after 8 decades of successful concealment, had he suddenly abandoned his secret refuge? The answers to those questions lay scattered throughout the chamber, written in Kellner's own hand, across thousands of pages of meticulous documentation. What the three explorers had stumbled upon wasn't just the solution to a wartime mystery. It was evidence of the most extraordinary survival story in modern history. And the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Marcus picked up the first journal, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The pages were filled with entries spanning from August 1944 to just days before their discovery. As he read the opening passages aloud to his companions, the scope of Kellner's incredible story began to unfold. August 16th, 1944. I have made my choice. The bunker construction beneath Berlin is my salvation. Heinrich showed me the entrance 3 months ago during my leave. He believed these tunnels would serve as shelters for high-ranking officials if the Reich fell. He was wrong about their purpose, but right about their potential. I have enough supplies to last 6 months. By then, the war will be over, and I can decide whether to surrender or disappear forever. Sarah discovered a detailed map showing Kellner's route from France to Berlin. He had traveled at night, using forged papers and stolen civilian clothes. The journey took him 3 weeks, moving through a network of abandoned buildings and forgotten passages that honeycombed the German capital. He'd known about this particular chamber from his pre-war engineering work on Berlin's infrastructure. When the Nazis began constructing emergency bunkers throughout the city, Kellner had quietly prepared his own sanctuary. The early entries revealed a man consumed by guilt and paranoia. Kellner wrote extensively about the atrocities he'd witnessed on the Eastern Front. He documented the names of war criminals, recording their actions in excruciating detail. Page after page contained evidence that could have convicted dozens of Nazi officials after the war. But Kellner never emerged to share what he knew. Instead, he remained hidden, wrestling with his conscience in the darkness beneath Berlin. Dmitri found boxes containing forged identity documents spanning 8 decades. Kellner had become a master of reinvention, creating new personas whenever his current identity became compromised. Karl Hoffmann, the night watchman. Friedrich Müller, the maintenance worker. Hans Weber, the retired librarian. Each identity came with carefully crafted backstories, complete with employment records and housing documents. He'd lived dozens of lives while maintaining only one true existence in his underground refuge. The journals revealed how Kellner had survived the war's end and the subsequent Allied occupation. He emerged occasionally at night, scavenging for supplies and gathering information about the changing world above. When the Soviets blockaded Berlin in 1948, he watched from hidden observation points as Allied planes delivered supplies during the airlift. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, he documented its construction from tunnels that ran directly beneath the death strip. November 9, 1989. They are tearing down the wall. I can hear the celebration above. People are singing and crying with joy. I have watched this city divide, and now I watch it reunite. But I remain below, unchanged, untouched by the passage of time. Sometimes I wonder if I am already dead, if this is some form of purgatory for the sins I witnessed and failed to prevent. The three explorers found evidence of Kellner's remarkable adaptation to underground life. He'd tapped into electrical systems to power lights and a small radio. A complex water filtration system provided clean drinking water from the city's pipes. Hidden ventilation shafts brought fresh air from street level. Most impressively, he'd created multiple escape routes connecting his chamber to different parts of Berlin's tunnel network. If one entrance was discovered, he could vanish through another. But survival was only part of Kellner's story. The journals revealed his true mission during those 8 decades of hiding. He'd been gathering intelligence, documenting the activities of Nazi war criminals who had escaped justice after the war. Using his various false identities, he'd tracked former SS officers living under assumed names throughout Germany. He recorded their locations, their new identities, and evidence of their wartime crimes. Marcus discovered a filing cabinet containing hundreds of dossiers. Former concentration camp guards working as shopkeepers in Munich, SS officers who'd become respected businessmen in Hamburg, Gestapo agents living as pensioners in Frankfurt. Kellner had spent 80 years building the most comprehensive database of hidden Nazi war criminals in existence, but he'd never shared this information with authorities. The question was, why? The answer came in a journal entry from 1960. I have compiled enough evidence to convict 1,000 war criminals. But who would believe the testimony of a man who faked his own death? Who would trust intelligence gathered by someone living as a ghost beneath the city? My evidence would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Worse, revealing myself would expose the other members of the Iron Cross resistance who survived the war. Some have built new lives, married, had children. I will not destroy their peace for the sake of justice that may never come. Sarah found photographs showing Kellner at different ages, always taken in the same chamber but spanning decades. The images revealed his gradual aging in a face marked by solitude and purpose. In early photos, he appeared gaunt and haunted. Later images showed a man who'd found peace with his choices, even as the world above him changed beyond recognition. The most recent entries revealed why Kellner had finally abandoned his sanctuary. His health was failing. At 129 years old, he could no longer maintain his underground existence. More importantly, he'd learned that several of the war criminals he'd been tracking were near death themselves. His life's work was becoming irrelevant as time claimed his targets faster than justice ever could. March 8, 2024. The doctor confirmed what I already knew. The cancer has spread. I have perhaps weeks, certainly not months. After 80 years of hiding, I find myself strangely relieved. The burden of secrecy has grown heavier than the weight of my crimes. It is time to emerge from the shadows, to face whatever judgment awaits. But where had Kellner gone? Dmitri discovered a note tucked inside the journal's back cover. The handwriting was shakier than previous entries, reflecting the author's declining health. To whoever finds this chamber, my name is Friedrich Kellner. I am the last surviving member of the Iron Cross resistance. I have lived beneath your city for 80 years, documenting the sins of my generation and the changing world above. The files in this room contain evidence of war crimes that were never prosecuted. Use this information as you see fit. I have gone to the surface to spend my final days in the sunlight I have not felt for 8 decades. Do not look for me. I will not be found again." The 3 explorers spent 6 hours cataloging everything in the chamber. The evidence was overwhelming. Kellner's journals provided first-hand testimony about war crimes, resistance activities, and the hidden survival of Nazi fugitives throughout post-war Germany. His photographs and documents painted an incredible picture of life in divided Berlin from the perspective of someone who'd watched it all unfold from below. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden behind a false wall, Marcus found a final cache of documents that would change everything they thought they knew about the Iron Cross resistance. Maps showing a network of underground facilities throughout Europe, radio equipment capable of long-range communication, and most disturbing of all, evidence that Kellner hadn't been alone in his underground exile. The documents revealed that the Iron Cross resistance hadn't been completely destroyed in 1944. Some members had survived, going into deep hiding throughout Germany and occupied Europe. They'd maintained contact through coded radio transmissions, sharing intelligence and resources across a network that spanned the continent. Kellner's chamber wasn't just a hiding place. It was a communications hub for a shadow organization that had been operating beneath the surface of European society for 80 years. Sarah found a roster listing dozens of names, many with recent status updates. Some members had died of old age. Others had been discovered and arrested over the decades. But a surprising number remained active, living double lives while maintaining their original mission of documenting Nazi war crimes and tracking fugitive war criminals. The final revelation came in a document dated just 1 week earlier. A meeting had been called. The surviving members of the Iron Cross resistance were gathering for the first time since 1944. Their location was coded, but the implications were clear. After 8 decades of hiding, these elderly resistance fighters were finally ready to emerge from the shadows and reveal what they'd discovered during their long exile. But why now? What had changed to make them abandon their carefully maintained secrecy? And most importantly, where were they meeting? The answers to these questions would lead the 3 explorers into a conspiracy that reached far beyond one missing colonel. They were about to discover that World War II had never really ended for some people. It had simply moved underground, where it had been quietly fought for 8 decades by ghosts who refused to let history forget its darkest chapters. As they photographed the last of the documents and prepared to leave the chamber, none of them realized they were being watched. Hidden cameras, installed decades earlier by Kellner himself, had recorded their every movement. Somewhere in Berlin, an elderly man with failing health watched their discovery on a flickering monitor, knowing that his secret was finally safe in capable hands. The colonel's war was nearly over. But for Marcus, Sarah, and Dmitri, the real mystery was just beginning. The surveillance footage told a story that none of the 3 explorers could have imagined. Hidden throughout Berlin's tunnel network were dozens of cameras, all connected to a central monitoring system that Kellner had constructed over the course of decades. Every entrance, every passage, every hidden chamber was under constant observation. And now, as Marcus, Sarah, and Dmitri made their way back through the cramped tunnels toward the surface, they were being tracked by eyes they couldn't see. 12 kilometers away, in a basement facility beneath an unremarkable apartment building in Kreuzberg, Friedrich Kellner sat before a bank of monitors displaying feeds from across the city's underground. At 129 years old, his body was failing, but his mind remained sharp. He'd been expecting this day for years. Someone would eventually find his chamber. The question wasn't if, but when and who. Now he had his answer. The 3 young explorers had been careful, respectful. They'd photographed everything without disturbing the arrangement of items. They'd read his journals with the reverence of historians, not the greed of treasure hunters. Most importantly, they'd recognized the significance of what they'd discovered. These weren't urban adventurers looking for thrills, they were the right people to carry his story forward. Kellner's fingers moved slowly across a keyboard, typing commands into a system he'd built himself over decades of patient work. Across the city, other cameras activated. Other monitoring stations came online. For 80 years, he'd been watching Berlin change from below. Now it was time to reveal the full scope of what he'd been watching, and why. Back in the tunnel, Sarah stopped suddenly. A sound echoed from somewhere ahead of them, metallic and deliberate. Marcus raised his hand, signaling for silence. They listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Still, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an electricity that hadn't been there before. Dmitri checked his phone. No signal, as expected this deep underground. But his GPS showed something impossible. According to the device, they were moving in the wrong direction. The tunnel that should have led them back to their entry point was somehow taking them deeper into the network. The passage itself hadn't changed, but their location coordinates were shifting in ways that defied logic. What they didn't know was that Kellner was guiding them. Through a system of hidden mechanisms built into the tunnel walls, he could alter the apparent direction of passages, opening some routes while sealing others. The three explorers thought they were retracing their steps, but they were actually being led to a destination Kellner had chosen for them. The passage opened into a much larger chamber, far grander than anything they'd seen before. This wasn't a single room carved out of concrete. It was an entire underground complex, with multiple levels connected by spiral staircases and corridors lined with reinforced steel. Emergency lighting flickered to life automatically, revealing the scope of what lay hidden beneath Berlin's streets. Marcus whistled softly. The chamber extended in every direction, disappearing into shadows beyond their flashlight beams. Along the walls, they could see dozens of doorways leading to smaller rooms. Maps covered every visible surface, showing not just Berlin but cities across Europe, marked with symbols and notations in multiple languages. This wasn't just Kellner's hideout, it was headquarters for something much larger. Sarah found herself drawn to a wall covered with photographs. Hundreds of faces stared back at her, spanning decades of portraits. Some were young men in military uniforms from the 1942nd. Others showed the same faces aged by time, photographed secretly in civilian settings across the years. Names were written beneath each image in Kellner's precise handwriting, along with dates and locations. But these weren't just random surveillance photos. As she studied them more carefully, Sarah realized she was looking at a visual history of the Iron Cross resistance. The young faces belonged to Wehrmacht officers who'd turned against the Nazi regime. The older images showed how they'd aged in hiding, maintaining secret lives while pursuing their mission across 8 decades. Dmitri discovered something even more remarkable in an adjoining room. Shelves lined with journals, hundreds of them, each labeled with different names and locations. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest. The Iron Cross resistance hadn't been limited to Germany. It had spread across occupied Europe, with cells operating in every major city where Nazi war criminals might have fled after the war's end. The journals contained detailed surveillance reports spanning decades. Former SS officers tracked to new identities in Argentina. Concentration camp guards discovered working as teachers in Austrian schools. Gestapo agents who'd become respected citizens in Swiss banking. Each entry was meticulously documented with photographs, addresses, employment records, and evidence of wartime crimes. But the most shocking discovery was the dates on the most recent entries. This wasn't just historical documentation, the surveillance was ongoing. Members of the Iron Cross resistance were still operating, still gathering intelligence, still tracking down the last surviving war criminals from Hitler's regime. At ages approaching or exceeding 100 years old, these elderly spies continued their mission with the dedication of true believers. Marcus found a communications center that belonged in a Cold War spy thriller, radio equipment capable of reaching across continents, encrypted transmission logs showing regular contact between resistance cells throughout Europe and South America, codebooks written in multiple languages, dead drop locations marked on maps of major cities worldwide. The scope was breathtaking. For 80 years, while the world believed the Iron Cross resistance had been destroyed by the Gestapo, its survivors had been building the most comprehensive intelligence network in modern history. They'd tracked thousands of Nazi fugitives, documented their post-war activities, and maintained surveillance on their families and associates across multiple generations. A bulletin board near the communications equipment showed recent activity. Coded messages received from Prague, Vienna, and Buenos Aires within the past month. Status reports on targets in various cities. And, at the center of the board, a single document that made all three explorers freeze in recognition. It was a meeting agenda, dated just 5 days in the future. The heading read, Final Assembly, Operation Reckoning. Below that, a list of locations across Europe where surviving resistance members would gather simultaneously. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Warsaw. After 80 years of operating in isolation, the Iron Cross resistance was planning to surface all at once. Sarah photographed the agenda with shaking hands. The implications were staggering. If even half of the documented resistance members were still alive and active, they possessed enough evidence to reopen thousands of war crimes cases. Their testimony could implicate not just elderly Nazi fugitives, but the families and institutions that had harbored them for decades. But why reveal themselves now? What had changed to make such a dramatic step necessary? The answer came in a folder marked Final Targets. Inside were dossiers on 12 individuals, all elderly, all living under assumed identities in different countries. The documents revealed something that made the explorers' blood run cold. These weren't just random Nazi fugitives, they were members of a secret organization that had been operating parallel to the Iron Cross resistance for 8 decades. Former SS officers and Gestapo agents who'd escaped justice after the war hadn't simply disappeared into civilian life. They'd formed their own network, using stolen Nazi gold and looted assets to build legitimate businesses and political influence across Europe and South America. The folder contained evidence of this shadow network's activities spanning 8 decades. War criminals who'd become bank presidents, former concentration camp commanders who'd founded international corporations, SS officers who'd infiltrated European governments at the highest levels. They called themselves the Odessa Brotherhood, and they'd spent 80 years consolidating power and wealth while covering their tracks. More disturbing still, the documents showed that the Odessa Brotherhood wasn't content to simply enjoy their ill-gotten gains in peaceful retirement. They were planning something called Fourth Reich Protocols, a systematic effort to rehabilitate Nazi ideology through legitimate political channels, funding far-right political movements, spreading Holocaust denial through academic institutions, gradually normalizing fascist ideas for a new generation. The Iron Cross resistance had been watching and documenting these activities for decades. But they'd remained hidden because exposing the Odessa Brotherhood would have revealed their own existence. Now, with both organizations composed primarily of men in their hundreds, time was running out. The final battle between these two groups of elderly warriors was about to begin. Dmitri discovered a detailed timeline showing how the confrontation had been building for months. Several high-ranking Odessa Brotherhood members had died recently, creating succession disputes within their organization. Younger family members were fighting for control of the network's resources. Some wanted to abandon their grandfather's ideological mission and simply enjoy their inherited wealth. Others pushed for an accelerated implementation of the Fourth Reich protocols. The infighting had created vulnerabilities that the Iron Cross resistance was prepared to exploit. They'd identified the 12 most important Odessa Brotherhood leaders and planned to expose them simultaneously across multiple countries. With their enemies weakened by internal conflicts and advanced age, this represented the best opportunity the resistance would ever have to strike a decisive blow. But the operation carried enormous risks. Revealing themselves after 80 years of secrecy would expose every resistance member to retaliation. The Odessa Brotherhood had vast financial resources and political connections. They could destroy the lives of anyone who threatened them. For the elderly resistance fighters, this would truly be a final mission. Success or failure, there would be no returning to the shadows afterward. Marcus found a personal letter from Kellner to his fellow resistance members, apparently written shortly before he abandoned his underground chamber. The handwriting was shaky, reflecting his declining health, but the words carried the weight of 8 decades of conviction. My brothers and sisters in arms, we are old now, older than any generation of warriors in human history. We have fought our war in darkness and secrecy for longer than most nations have existed. We have sacrificed normal lives, families, happiness, all in service of a cause that the world forgot long ago. But our enemy has not forgotten. They have grown strong in the light, while we remained hidden in the shadows. The time has come to emerge, not because we seek glory or recognition, but because we may be the last generation capable of bearing witness to the truth. Let us end this war as we began it, with courage and honor, whatever the cost. The letter was signed not just by Kellner, but by dozens of names representing resistance cells across Europe. The scope of the organization was even larger than the 3 explorers had imagined. These weren't just a few isolated survivors hiding in underground chambers. They were a coordinated network of elderly spies who'd spent their entire adult lives pursuing justice that mainstream society had long since abandoned. As they continued exploring the complex, Sarah made another disturbing discovery: a medical facility, complete with surgical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies. Hospital beds occupied several rooms, showing signs of recent use. According to the medical logs, resistance members from across Europe had been coming to Berlin for treatment of age-related ailments and injuries. The network wasn't just gathering for their final operation. They were literally dying, one by one, as their bodies finally succumbed to nearly a century of stress and hardship. The medical records painted a heartbreaking picture of dedication beyond reason. Men and women in their late 90s and early hundreds, suffering from cancers, heart conditions, and degenerative diseases, still maintaining their surveillance activities and intelligence gathering. Some had been keeping watch on the same targets for over 70 years, passing information between generations of resistance members as needed. Dmitry found evidence of something even more remarkable in the facility's pharmacy: experimental medications and treatments that weren't available through normal medical channels. The resistance had somehow gained access to cutting-edge life extension therapies, possibly through sympathetic doctors or pharmaceutical industry contacts built up over decades of covert operations. They'd been literally fighting time itself, using advanced medicine to extend their lives long enough to complete their mission. But time was winning. The medical logs showed that resistance members were dying faster than they could be replaced. The younger generation had no knowledge of the organization's existence. Families of resistance members believed their elderly relatives were simply retired veterans living quiet lives. The Iron Cross resistance would die with its current members unless they acted immediately. Marcus discovered the final piece of the puzzle in a secure vault hidden behind the medical facility. Inside were enough classified documents to expose not just Nazi war criminals, but the governments, banks, and corporations that had protected them for 8 decades. Evidence of Swiss banks laundering stolen Nazi gold, American corporations that had knowingly employed war criminals as executives, European governments that had issued false identity papers to SS fugitives. The vault contained the most comprehensive archive of post-war Nazi activities ever assembled. If released to the public, it would implicate thousands of institutions and individuals in covering up war crimes spanning 8 decades. The political and financial ramifications would be enormous, potentially destabilizing governments and triggering international criminal investigations that could last for years. But that was exactly what the Iron Cross resistance intended. Their final operation wasn't just about exposing elderly war criminals. It was about revealing the entire system that had allowed them to escape justice and prosper in the post-war world. They were planning to detonate an information bomb that would shake the foundations of European society. As the 3 explorers prepared to leave the complex, they realized they'd stumbled into something far bigger than a historical mystery. They were witnesses to the final act of a secret war that had been raging beneath the surface of civilization for 80 years. In just 5 days, that war would finally emerge into the light. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. He would ever be the same. The discovery of Friedrich Kellner's underground sanctuary beneath Berlin's streets solved one of World War II's greatest mysteries, but it also unveiled something far more extraordinary. For 8 decades, while the world moved on from the horrors of Nazi Germany, a shadow war continued to rage in the darkness below our feet. The Iron Cross resistance, thought destroyed in 1944, had survived and thrived, building the most comprehensive intelligence network in modern history. Colonel Kellner's 80-year vigil wasn't just about survival or even justice. It was about memory, about ensuring that the darkest chapters of human history could never be forgotten or repeated. His underground chamber, filled with decades of meticulous documentation, stands as a testament to the power of individual conscience against overwhelming evil. The 3 urban explorers who found Kellner's hideout didn't just solve a historical puzzle. They uncovered evidence of a secret conflict that continues to this day, with implications that reach far beyond the underground tunnels of Berlin. The files they discovered have already triggered international investigations that may finally bring justice to the last surviving architects of genocide. Sometimes the most incredible stories aren't found in history books. They're hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light. Friedrich Kellner spent 80 years ensuring that the truth would eventually surface. In the end, that may be the most extraordinary victory of all. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.